Hi there. I am Ted McKenna here, co-author of the JOLT Effect, also co-author of a coming book called The Activator Advantage. I'm a co-founder of a company called Selling Innovation. So we spend all of our time looking at high performer sales behavior and helping others to replicate those through training programs and other development experiences. Also help to co-found a company called DCM Insights, which is our business that focuses on professional services and helping those folks in those businesses develop relationships and sell, but don't call it sell in those situations. And so, yeah, happy to be here. I live in Chicago, or just outside of the city of Chicago here in the U.S. Yeah, super happy to be here with you today.
Ted, it's great to have you. How rare is high performing? What's your measure of high performing in sales?
So we typically like to look at, when we say high performance, we typically mean like top 20% performer.
Okay.
Um, each company tends to have its own definition of what they consider to be high performance. We will tell people generally we like gap to goal or some approximation thereof. And, you want to look at it over at least a long enough period of time that it feels like it's a representative sample, maybe a year or two's worth of data. But I think, just there's also like a gut feel. When you ask most sales leaders, they have a general sense for this person acts like a set of high performers. The reason we pick 20%, by the way, is purposeful, because I think there's probably a lot of people who think, when you look at our data, actually, 80% of our sales is driven by 5 or 10% of those folks. And that's true, I think, in some businesses. But we look at 20% or something like that because we find that to be more exportable. So what we're looking for is not just inspiration for what those folks are doing, and also not just inspiration for what they are figuring out. That's the reason we often look at what we call lead steers, because these are the people who are out there having already figured out the right or left turns that buyers have made, and they've found ways to adapt. And so we like studying their behavior, but it's not just that we need to understand what they're doing. We also then need to find ways to help others replicate that behavior. And what you find is if you're only looking at those very, very, very top special, humans, it's not always the most exportable set of things that they're doing. And, some of those kind of lone wolves, if you will, I'm not even sure heads of sales would even want them necessarily replicating some of the things that they are doing. And so when you get to 20%, you tend to find a wider sample of folks who are both overperforming, but also things that kind of the middle 60% can take and replicate and lean a little bit harder in that direction.
So if you take that top 20% and you go, this behavior is winning, what proportion of the chunk beneath that can you get up to acceptable?
I see you didn't ask it this way, but you see a lot of things on, LinkedIn and whatever about like, oh, so few, reps are hitting their goals these days. And I always think that's sort of a weird way to look at sales, because goal setting, of course, can be rather subjective. And plus they're designed such that only a certain percentage of the team will hit their goal. So the evidence that they're not hitting the goal shouldn't actually be necessarily a sign of high or low performance. That's why we look at it across an entire sales force, the top 20% of that sales force. But the second part of your question, I think, speaks to the ability for others to act more like high
Yeah.
performers. And when you think about that, it depends on what you mean by act like high performers, because, what we don't expect is that people overnight are going to be high performers. And that means they're doing this all the time in every setting across the entire skill set. But what you hope is that more and more of those people lean harder and more often in those directions. So they take on some of those skills that high performers do, but not just with just not as much regularity as you might hope, right? Or they might be, let's say there's 3 or 4 key skills. Like in our study around indecision, there were 4 key skills we found high performers did differently than their peers. So the middle performer might be able to take on 1 or 2 of those things and increase on that front, and therefore increase their performance, even though they themselves still might not be considered a high performer.
If sales was like being a doctor, and if you were not very good at it, people would die. What proportion of those people who have the job title salespeople do you think we should retire on the grounds
Ooh,
of the health of other people?
that is a tough question. Eh, yes.
More than zero,
Listen,
less than
for
100.
sure. Yeah, look, I'm probably not in a terrific position to judge that entirely. But having been on the receiving end of a whole bunch of emails from certain folks trying to get my attention as a buyer, I certainly can think it's more than 0% to your point that probably shouldn't be in the profession. If you were to talk to buyers, and you can surmise this a little bit through some of the things we're hearing from senior sales leaders about, it seems more difficult than ever to get in with very senior buyers, to elevate the conversation to these very senior folks. I think there is an increasing sense from those buyers that the sales profession can struggle to resonate and to build messages that strike a chord with those folks, and they haven't really leveled up their game. I mean, that's kind of my observation, is that if you look back across a lot of the research that we did, going back to my days at CEB, that was part of the Challenger sale research and all of that, there's a whole thread of buyers are learning more and more on their own, and that has only continued.
Yeah.
Now they can use ChatGPT and all sorts of Gen AI as a way to continue that learning. And if anything, it feels like sales has kind of stopped that. Like, the sales as a profession doesn't seem to have kept pace with the learning that buyers have. And you can see it then translate into, communications that feels kind of empty and generic, and buyers start to tune out. So I'm kind of, this is a roundabout way of getting to your answer, because I don't have a hard number there, but it's more than I think than we would care to admit, I think, is a fair
Is
way to
it
say it.
half?
I don't know that I'd say it's half. The other
Okay.
thing that you're not saying, but often maybe people imply, is that buyers don't want to engage with salespeople and they want a fully digital experience. And is
Mm,
the sales profession dying entirely? That I don't see any real evidence for. I think it's a trendy thing for people, on LinkedIn, to talk about buyers not needing salespeople or not wanting salespeople. I have plenty of data that shows, in fact, that they actually do need them, even more than they know that they need them,
I
especially as purchases get more emotional in nature. But I do think that there's a whole host of salespeople that haven't evolved in the way that buyers need to. And there's definitely the chance that as buyers can do more on their own, as they're given the option to buy things on their own, if they're given tools to make predictions as to which company they should buy from versus another, then it may stand to reason that the buyers themselves might retire some of these sellers, I guess, is one way to think about it.
totally. Well, it's interesting because it comes back to, like, what is our working definition of sales? And
Yeah.
when I've had conversations with Justin Roth-Marsh, it's selling is persuading you to do a thing that when you were brushing your teeth this morning, you weren't planning to do. And that whole Gen AI buyer process, the buyer has already decided that they have a problem and that they already are searching for a solution. And then when they stumble across a seller, the seller is facilitating the ordering process, maybe, which is
Hmm.
not necessarily my definition of selling.
Right.
That would be, I I'm going to talk to you, Ted, because I think you should buy this thing. Now, you might not think there's a solution. It might not be on your priority list of things to fix because you've decided, there's lower hanging fruit or something else. And that process of um, interrupting you to see if this is a priority, I think
Yep.
ends up is sales. And lots of people do that. I mean, I like you, I get emails all the time and I think it's a bit like Nigerian, I don't know, you send me your bank details and I'll send you $1 million. It's like,
Yeah.
does anybody, I get these emails. It's like, when you've sent out 3,000 of these, do you not think maybe I should stop? It's not working.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. I do think there's an interesting potential evolution here in terms of, like, the identity of what a seller is most helpful in doing in making those decisions, right? Because I mean, I think if you're a head of sales and you're looking to drum up demand, you're always going to think, sure, there's a set of buyers who are drawing their own conclusions about whether they need my thing or not, or whether we're the preferred supplier or not, and then they're hitting the contact us form on the site, or they're asking for a demo, and that's the way we learn about their interest. I'm sure there's a subset of those sales leaders who would be correct in assuming that if we only rely on that, we're not going to sell enough, right? There's going to be times we have to convince buyers that they've misdiagnosed their problems, or that they've underappreciated some issue, or that perhaps they didn't fully appreciate just how great we were relative to some of the other competitors. And so you're trying to find incremental demand there, right? But that's still, I think, under your persuasion umbrella, right?
Yeah.
That the primary thing that the seller is doing is persuading this buyer that now is the time to do this, and that this is a worthy, spend of your dollars and what have you. And that still remains a very important part of what the seller does. But I think, the more and more the buyer can learn on their own what they want to do, the more and more they can rely on prediction engines to filter out
Yep.
some of that noise and tell them do this thing versus that thing, which, by the way, Gartner's Magic Quadrant's never going to do, right? They're never going to say buy from this company, not that company, because they want to sell to both those companies. And also, of course, it's shades of gray, right? In true fairness, right? It's not always black and white whether this vendor is better than that vendor, but that's not going to stop the Gen AI tool from saying that, in fact, you should buy from this one versus that one. And my point being is, as buyers can do more of that on their own, then the incremental benefit they get from working with that seller shifts not just from persuasion into the relief and comfort they can get that they're not going to fail, and that's where the indecision study really went. And it's one of the reasons you see emotion kind of rising up in those experiences with sellers.
Let's dive into some of that indecision framework that you
Hmm.
spoke about and the difference between the best people and the not best people. People might not have seen the conversation that I had with Matt, your co-author, on the JOLT
Yeah,
effect. So let's dive into that. What and it was I just remember, it's fantastic. COVID, here's a benefit of COVID. You for the first time ever, you got all these enterprise calls recorded and you had access to
yeah,
data. So what did you have? What did you do? And what did you find?
yeah. So yeah, one of the only real benefits of what for society was quite awful. All of a sudden, all these conversations that were happening in offices around the world, or in coffee shops around the world, were happening on Zoom or Teams, and we could understand and record those conversations at scale, understand what's happening. So what we found, the basic premise of the study was that sellers were losing at a higher rate than we expected, especially in situations where it felt like the buyer was pretty excited, that they seemed inclined to purchase. They felt like they intended to do something. They were sold on the need for change, and they might have even won selection. So if they're going to buy from any provider, they're going to buy from that single provider.
Can
Good.
I just want to dive in because it's a conversation I
Hmm.
was having with a client the other day. An organization has a sales process. And I've seen organizations in the past where, they say, oh, it takes eight conversations to convert, and there's a thing at the end, and then we generate. Sometimes I'll see sellers shortcut the process because the buyer seems so excited. The buyer is pushing the seller to move faster through the process because they say they're already sold. Did you
Mm.
did you correct for that? Or
So you could see that in the data. We didn't always have the longitudinal
okay.
data to be able to say, call 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 versus call 1, 2, 3 and what have you. But we built a big, huge predictive model, 8,000 plus variables, and then correlated it to outcomes like did that sale end up closing or not. And this is what you can do with machine learning, right? Very, very, very large data
8,000
sets,
variables. Wow.
2.5 million calls, 8,000 plus variables. And so what you end up seeing is that certainly, in many instances, it was exactly that the buyer was very quick to say that we're ready to go, and then it was stalling out. So the broader thing for us was you saw more stalls in places that you shouldn't have expected stalls to
Yes.
happen, right? Like buyers excited, they seem inclined to purchase, that you've won selection, and the seller was doing all that persuasive stuff that you mentioned earlier, right? They're creating that
Yeah.
burning platform, helping them understand the need for change, and they were still stalling out. That for us was the big news item, and that sort of unlocked the story, if you will. That's where we then started learning more about what happens when people are indecisive, and what drives indecision. And then you start to see pockets of these fears popping up in conversation, these frustrations and uncertainties that maybe without that, having understood that effect, you might have either missed in passing or assumed it was just part of the general drowning, of
Yeah.
pain that the buyer is experiencing, and knowing
And
now that it's a different thing. It's rooted in a different place, which is that they worry that even if I go to do this, if this goes wrong, and they've often had things go wrong. We all bring baggage into the conversation, right? We've all had implementations gone awry and what have you. And when it goes wrong, they're primarily worried about messing up and getting blamed for it. And in those cases, no amount of persuasion, no amount of urges, no amount of discounts are going to make the buyer feel like, okay, then I will move forward, even though I'm worried that this thing, when it goes wrong, I'm going to get blamed. Because if it fails, people look at and point fingers at the person who made that decision.
And so, am I right in remembering that what you found was that 60% of these things where people said yes then stalled out?
So we found 40 to 60% of
For
deals end in no decision.
yes, okay,
Correct.
that's yeah.
A subset of those are due to them having, of course, a real preference for the status quo.
Yeah.
But then also the majority of them is about the fact that they're indecisive due to this fear of failure. So we have to overcome indifference, to be clear. Like, that still remains a very, very big reason why buyers don't make a decision, but it's not the only reason things end in no decision. And that's where the JOLT study really helped us understand about that indecision.
Because those indecision ones wouldn't end with a yes, let's go, whereas these
That's
ones are
right.
going with a yes, let's go, and they're not happening over the line. I mean, that's a different set of problems over there. And
To your point, it's
what?
it's even harder for the seller, right? Because the buyer's saying yes, but not yet, sort of, right? And
Yes.
so it's like it's even harder because there's this head fake into they're excited. They seem like they've told me they want to buy. They seem like they're very inclined to purchase. What's going on? And they're sort of left scratching their head.
And then all those other things that you mentioned, like discounts and da 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 da, right? They're all a company thing. They're not a personal. They're not addressing any of my personal fear, and they're not typically going to say, "Oh, well, like I think it's a great idea for the company, but I'm going to get fired." I mean, it's just you're not. People aren't going to put their hands up and say that.
Well, so it's an interesting point about those urgency drivers typically are more about the company and the budget, the team, and less about their own personal, fear that they have. But you're exactly right, though, that these fears that they're experiencing, which we saw in our study and also has been validated through decades worth of psychology studies. And also, I think we can just personally know that this happens to all of us too. When I go to buy something, when I go to buy a car, or when I go to buy, anything, I'm always worried, like, am I going to look like an idiot, having done this? And that speaks to the very personal aspect of this. And you're absolutely right that one of the hard parts, and this is the, for those familiar with the JOLT effect, it's an acronym, and that first J is judging the level of indecision. A very big part of this for a seller, or helping a buyer overcome it, is first understanding, is this happening or not? Because exactly to your point, buyers don't just come out and tell you, I stink at making decisions, or that I worry about this thing going wrong. Either they're not aware of it, or they're not going to cop to it. They won't admit to it because they regard themselves as very senior executives who make decisions all the time. And so it would feel weird for me to say that I'm struggling with this, because if it goes wrong and I get blamed, I'm going to look foolish in nature. And so the seller has to find ways to surface it, because we know it's there. In our study, we found 87% of opportunities had either moderate or high levels of indecision. So it is there. We just have to find it in sort of plain hidden sight, if you will.
So, what were the five things that the best sellers did?
Yeah, well, so the first, I think, most important lesson of the
And do
study
they?
is,
And I didn't know that JOLT was an acronym. Somehow I've read
yeah,
the book, talked to Matt, and so I don't, I didn't, I don't know what it all
yeah,
stands for.
yeah. Well, that's double meaning too, right? So the best sellers are jolting customers into action, jolting them
Yeah,
past their indecision, but it also stands for the four key behaviors. But even before we get there, the other big lesson from the study was our instinct in those situations when the buyer gets cold feet is to assume that it's a problem with my persuasion, to your point
yeah,
earlier, that they are not fully convinced on the need. And even though they're saying they are. And so I throw back at them all of those reasons that I did before about the, why this is so important, and, all the benefits you're going to get, all the bad things will happen if you don't make the decision, all the fake urgency that I tried to drive. And what we found in those situations for that highly indecisive buyer, it backfires. 84% of the time, it makes things worse, not better. So the first most important lesson is, be really careful in those situations when the buyer is really gripped by indecision, to not throw more fear on top of what is already a fearful buyer in those
uh
situations.
huh,
Don't make matters worse. And that's tough, because their instinct is, the only playbook they've ever been given is, run the FUD playbook, run the persuasion playbook, try our best to scare the buyer into that purchase. It's about finding that need. And then if I can't convince the buyer that the need is big enough, then I orient them to all the painful things that will happen, right? That's the playbook all of us know and love, right? Because it's a very effective playbook, except when they're dealing with indecision, and there we need to be careful about pouring gasoline, I guess, on that fear. So that's the first big lesson. And then when you get into then how can we help buyers overcome indecision, the four key behaviors break down as, so the first one is about understanding the size and depth and breadth of indecision. I need to judge it partly for selfish reasons. I want to qualify opportunities and forecast that opportunity based on that buyer's ability to make a decision, not just on their ability to buy. But then in doing so, as I surface those sort of hidden areas of indecision that might be cloaked in really positive things, like, you guys are amazing, there's so much good things here, but that also indicates that they struggle with one of the big fears around indecision. So the next three ones are going to all be aimed at helping to overcome it. So as I judge that indecision, I'm going to learn about, are they struggling with one of three big fears we find that buyers struggle with? First one being options overload. So for the buyer that's really struggling with, over and above whether I want to purchase from you, I'm not sure which direction to go in first and in what
Yeah.
proportion, which packages to go with, which implementation plan or onboarding plan or users to start with. And it feels overwhelming for them. They all look kind of right. So in those situations, because the buyer struggles with trade-offs, the best sellers are making very firm, very personal recommendations about which
Yeah.
path to head down, right? And it has this effect of, for the buyer, feeling like I'm sharing in that choice with you. I'm shifting some of that blame that I worry about from them over to the seller in making that recommendation. Or I could, for a buyer who's really struggling with analysis paralysis, they have so much information, but it's actually the fact that they have access to so much information drives this insatiable desire for more and more homework. I have to be a good steward of my organizational resources. And so until and unless I know that there aren't any skeletons in the closet and there aren't any surprises hidden around the corner, I'm going to keep exploring. And so in those situations, the best sellers, they're finding ways to limit the exploration to healthy rather than excessive levels. And there's a
Hmm.
couple of techniques that we see sellers doing, especially inside of and after interactions with buyers. And then finally, the last skill is it's called taking risk off the table for those buyers who feel like the expectations for what we're trying to do might outpace our ability to achieve those things. That there's too many uncertainties about the outcomes we're about to go, too many dependencies, too many variables. No amount of assurance has been enough for them. They feel like you've given them case studies and reference calls and all that good stuff, but they're going to be the one exception, right? That we stink at making change. We know this. And so in those cases, we find sellers needing to set very proper, grounded expectations about outcomes they should be caring about. And sometimes they have to find ways to de-risk those decisions, to give them some safety nets in those situations as a way to help those highly indecisive buyers.
That's fab. But you said that people do a few things, not the last one, but the one before that. You said, oh, people have the great
Hmm.
sellers have a couple of things that they do. What were the things that they do
Yeah.
to help the buyer overcome that?
So the primary thing we need to remember, when a buyer is heading into excessive rather than reasonable exploration. I mean, of course, any buyer is going to have to do some degree of exploration, right? We can't just tell them to stop asking questions or stop trying to explore. What we want to avoid them, though, is them spinning into analysis paralysis, where their fear starts to spread. They start to worry there's more potential that's going to go wrong than there actually is. And this, of course, manifests for a sailor by seller, not sailor, through like excessive amounts of demo requests, right? Or
Yeah.
all sorts of additional white papers or case studies or reference calls they want. Is that seventh demo really going to make that big of a difference? So because of that, right, what we have to find ways to do is establish ourselves as sort of a trusted expert for that buyer, right? Otherwise, they're going to feel like they themselves have to become that expert, which is going to take a long time because, of course, they're not an expert on your product. They're not an expert on even buying your thing. It might be the first time they've
Yeah.
ever bought something like this.
Yeah.
So the main skill we talk about here is what we call owning the flow of information. So this is the seller demonstrating to the buyer that they have done this before. They know where this road's headed. They have a sense for what blind alleys to avoid, what roads to take, and so this comes down to often the way that even they're interacting with the buyer. The absence of this, by the way, is when we just indulge these requests, that we just let the buyer feed that desire for more and more information. But even worse, and this is something we talk to sales teams all the time about how they work with call partners in these situations, because these critical moments when we bring on subject matter experts as a way to demonstrate value becomes unwittingly a place where we actually undermine a lot of the trust that we might have built at that point. Because what the buyer sees is the seller abdicating responsibility for any form of expertise. They bring in Dominic as the expert to the conversation. They say, Dominic, I'm so glad you got a chance to meet, Mr. or Mrs. Smith here. Dominic, take it away. And then they recede into the background for the next, 55 minutes. And the buyer's left wondering, like, why is this person even here? Like, what
Yeah.
are they doing here other than just having made this introduction? So the opposite of that, of course, the opposite of abdicating responsibility is you are the conductor. You are the orchestrator of the experience. You're very clear about why Dominic's here and what purpose he's holding. You're bringing him into the conversation. You're taking him out of the conversation. There's a whole series of other things that you can do in preparation for and in follow up to those meetings. And of course, it's not the only thing you're doing as a way to limit the expiration, but it's, I think, often kind of the place where it distills down for sellers. Like, okay, because I've seen the opposite. So it makes sense to me how owning the full information can be a really powerful way to show that buyer that you're looking out on their behalf, right? That you've been
Yes.
there before, you understand the process, and you're in good hands.
Yes. And of course the maybe the poor or inexperienced rep, is in the forecasting meeting and saying, "Oh, they're fully engaged. They're having the eighth demo. This is amazing."
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
then they've got no idea that it's all just driven by indecision. Actually, some of it can be, I suppose, the buyer has said yes, and these extra demos are just procrastination around, you know, oh shit, now I'm on this roller coaster. And I
Yeah.
can see some sales that I've been involved in where, they really are fearful. And but because they don't want to be impolite,
Yes.
it's like, oh, but if I schedule another demo, I don't have to
It,
make a decision and
or
I'm
it's
not
not
being
for me, right?
impolite.
It's for this other person in the buying committee, right? They are the ones that
Yeah.
keep
I can
asking
just
for it,
make
but
this
we
whole
never,
thing longer and more painful. Yeah.
there's all these like kind of what if surprises. Like, what if this thing were to happen? What if that thing were to happen? And just, again, unless we're showing that we've thought these things through and we're experts in the process, it's very easy, to your point, to miss, to sort of see those signs as a sign of engagement.
When I had Matt on, I shared our episode with one of our clients because we just felt like it was something that we were talking about. And he read the book, watched the episode, and he rang me up and he went, "That's 4 deals closed." It was around the risk mitigation. It was just how do we take away the risk so that if the individual says yes, there's nothing can touch them. There's enough of a value delivery before payment or changing the terms or ability to walk away.
Yeah.
They did a few different things with some clients where some deals were just hanging around, and it was just like just unlocked them straight away.
Mm. Yeah.
Fabulous. When we were talking before, we were talking about people who sell who don't like selling. So you've done some research in this space around professional services, lawyers, accountants,
Yeah.
and I've done a bit of work with some professional services people who definitely don't like to use the S word for their the influence that they bring to somebody parting with money. Did you find it was different when you did the research?
On the surface it's different. So in professional services, in particular, in places where these people are what you might consider doer sellers, people who they have to sell and execute on that piece of business. They're running the relationship, but also they are the subject matter expert who's expected and tasked with delivery, right? They have to go and fulfill the promises they've just made. So typically, these are in law firms, accounting firms, consulting firms, banking, talent advisory, you name, different types of consulting. Less so, we can come back to this if you want, the sort of professional services inside of a sales organization, because that person's typically handing off that relationship to they've converted the sale, and now somebody else's job is to deliver it.
Yeah, we've got lots of organizations where they sort of do what they call three in a box. So they might have somebody who owns the commercial relationship with the client,
Yeah.
and they'd have somebody who owns the delivery part of the relationship with the client, and then they have somebody who's the technical expert technical account manager, helping the
Yep.
client think about what the future might bring. And often those sort of account director and technical account manager they are selling and also responsible for delivery, and they only bring in the commercial person when there's something to be done. So,
Yeah.
that's very common for us in managed services
Yep.
organizations.
Yeah, so there were some parallels from our study on doer sellers that apply to people who are selling any form of services, especially with respect to how buyers are evolving the value they place on expertise. We can come back to that if you like, but the study itself was honed in on specifically those doer sellers who are doing
Yeah.
it all, right? And of course, by definition, it is a little different. Sales cycles never really end. It's just an ongoing set of experiences. It takes sometimes a very long time to build that trust and build that
Hmm.
relationship with that buyer. And you're selling a set of services across a whole host of things for a given firm. So the expectation is you sell your own stuff in your brain and the things that you're about to go and sell, but also hopefully opening up the doors for people across the firm and other capabilities the firm has. So yeah, we did this. We studied this in great depth starting about 2 years ago. In total, this was a survey that we launched, and now I think we've surveyed in total almost 3,000, a little less than that, partners, people
Hmm.
who have these expectations inside these professional services firms. Very large study, wide ranging in nature. So looking at all things business development, from early stage network building they're doing all the way through to closing business, ongoing negotiation and service execution, with those clients. We did a separate, smaller study of buyers, of clients, people who are buying these things, and one of the troubling things we found there right in the beginning was just a declining sense of loyalty. Less and less
Hmm.
clients feeling like just because you've done a great job on this last piece of work doesn't guarantee I'm going to hire you for that next piece of work, which for a long time for professional services firms, that was the hallmark. That was what they placed a lot of their sort of go-to-market assumptions on,
Yeah.
was that just great service equals next piece of business. Focus in on that execution and those people will hire you again. Well, we're finding less and less that to be true. So into this realm, we inserted this big study, and what we found was it turns out every person who does business development in this world can sort of describe their go to market approach in one of five different ways. Now, these
Uh-huh.
aren't mutually exclusive, meaning like people can have a mix of these different behaviors. They can kind of, if you think about it, like going to university or going to college, you kind of major in certain things and then you minor in other things. So these are kind of like the five majors out there in the world in terms of the emphasis that you place. And in most organizations, they're split relatively evenly in terms of the relative proportion of these folks.
Hmm.
There are some differences by vertical, law firms, banking firms, and what have you, but by and large, they're pretty evenly distributed. So the five profiles we found, there's the expert, right? So the expert is primarily looking to attract demand for their very specific subject matter expertise. They tend to be reactive in nature as a result when it comes to business development. I'm going to go speak on stages, or I'm going to go write white papers and hope people call me for my very specific niche expertise. Consequently, I often find myself in competitive situations because by the time they know they have a need, they're looking for the two or three or four biggest experts there, and now I'm having to pitch for that business. But they're kind of reluctant business developers. They'd rather spend their time being an expert, right?
Yeah.
Next one over is the confidant. So the confidant is the kind of classic old school trusted advisor. They're the person who has created a very deep, almost personal set of relationships with their clients, and then have kind of built a moat around them over time through white glove service. On the assumption again that the best thing I could do to get the next piece of business is to crush this piece of business and this matter or project or whatever it might be with these clients. And they also tend to very anchor themselves in very, very senior places. So I'll try to get to the CEO or board level if I can, and just anchor myself there for as long as I can. Next one is over at Activator. For those of you guys that may have seen this article in the Harvard Business Review, we talk about activators. So this is the winning profile for reasons I'll get to here in a moment. But think about the activator as kind of a super connector. They're finding ways to create value up and down a very wide and expansive set of network. They're very intentional about opening doors for people inside their network and inside their firm. So they're really good at cross selling and upselling across their organization. But they're kind of like, think about activators as acting almost like general contractors for expertise for people in their network, right? So they're demonstrating a different type of expertise. They are deep subject matter experts, and they bring lots of good ideas for their clients. But then they also, part of that idea generation is also about thinking about their client needs over and above their own personal level of expertise. Next one over is the debater. So the debater, for those in your audience that know the challenger sale, this is probably the profile that's the closest thing to the challenger. They always have a different perspective on the world. They're not afraid to share that perspective. In fact, they're quite eager to share that perspective. The debater, I think, especially in these settings, often comes through stylistically, though, as looking to kind of try to be a little bit a debater, right? Kind of controversial in nature. Be that contrarian in nature, which I think in professional services over time, you're working with this very closely with these clients, can start to run the wrong way, over time. And then finally, the realist. The realist actually, it probably is more closely associated with that jolt seller that I was speaking to a moment ago. But these are the people who want to transit in honesty and transparency. They want to come through as like, I'm a great steward of my customers' budget, but also of my own organization, my firm's resources. So they're very comfortable telling the client no for projects that feel like no-win situations. They're very protective of their team's time in those situations, maybe even too protective. So they come across almost not idealistic enough, like too practical. Like they need, the clients need a little bit of a dreamer, somebody who can think innovatively about those projects. So those are the 5 profiles. Of those 5, we found only one actually outperforms or can improve in this environment. So that's the activator. Every other profile, if you were to get better at that profile, if you will, if you were to lean harder in that direction for that profile, you find performance actually goes down over time in terms of business development. So you can improve performance by up to 32% just by getting better, becoming a really good activator. And if you want, I can kind of double click on what that activator is doing.
Yeah, no, that'd be brilliant. And the HBR article, do you remember the title off the top of your head? I mean, if you can't, it's fine. We'll find it and put it in the show notes.
What today's rainmakers do differently. What today's rainmakers do differently.
Yeah. So what are the activators doing?
If you just search up my name, Ted McKenna, or Matt Dixon name, Rory Channer and Karen Freeman are other co-authors on that article, and Harvard Business Review should be able to find that. So yeah, the three big behaviors the activators doing differently than their peers is, the first thing is they're making business development a habitual aspect of their day-to-day and their week-to-week. So they commit to business development in great depth. So what does that mean? They're spending time in business development almost every single day, certainly each week. They're finding ways to make that a regular rather than a sporadic thing. What you find with non-activators, even when they do spend time on business development, it tends to be when they have time for it, when the project ends or when the matter ends. And it feels for the client very sporadic in nature. They're in their clients' lives and then they leave their clients' lives. You hear things from clients like, I get tons of value when I'm working with someone between projects, between matter, when it feels like they're providing off the clock type of advice. They're willing to help make introductions or help me understand issues or subjects, even if we're not engaged at that matter. And so activators are really good and intentional about staying in the rhythm, if you will, with those clients, adding value even between projects. Now, there's probably a second thing you're wondering there is how can they find time for it? So they're also very efficient in how they do that. They're very ruthless even in how they think about what's the best opportunity that I should be spending time on and what's a real good business opportunity and what not be, what might not be. The second thing they're doing is then they're using that to then connect in a very deep way with that network. So they build very interconnected, very deep networks on a bunch of different dimensions. So yes, with clients and inside their client organizations, so up and down, not just with the senior people, but their junior team members and others, but also inside their own firm. So they understand how they can open doors and what types of capabilities they can look to cross-sell and upsell, even third-party individuals across their network who can be useful and helpful for people in their network. So you hear about lawyers looking for, a banker that they can refer in for their clients, or accountants that can be really useful for their business. They understand the types of people and expertise that they can position on behalf of their network, and make that kind of a living, breathing organism, if you will. And then finally, they're creating value up and down that network. So they're very proactive in bringing ideas to those clients. You hear lots of situations where the client is hearing things like, this person thought of me to send over this article or send over this piece of information. They're of course using insight when they are working with clients as well. So again, helping them think differently about problems, differently about their world, but doing so in a way that feels representative of the relationship they built, the knowledge of their business, and what have you.
It's interesting. As you describe that, what comes to mind is the best CEOs that I work with who are still having a huge impact on business development in their organization. So they have a whole sales organization doing a thing, but you've described where businesses are, what I see, where businesses are really, 100% year over year, really the CEO is still the possibly even the largest rainmaker in the organization. And
Yeah,
because what they'll do is they'll find themselves in a position where I'm talking to you, Ted, you're telling me about an opportunity you have. Like, it's a product we don't sell, it's a way in which we've put our resources together. We might have pulled something in from the network and merged it with us. We don't want the sellers making that stuff up, because that's not,
yeah,
they can't commit the organization's resources to this. And so if the CEO is the only person who can do that. And the best ones are, that deal that got landed that so and so got the commission for, frankly, only came about because the CEO did the deal and then gave it to somebody to do the paperwork, and not
yeah.
because the seller did it themselves. And so I think that's fascinating.
It's an interesting parallel because it's. I think you're right. There's kind of two aspects. One you mentioned, which is, yeah, they're out there developing very strategic relationships and finding ways to connect the dots and open doors in ways that creates opportunity for others, which is definitely something the Activator is doing. But also they're connecting the dots on disparate bits of information, right? They're synthesizing, what they're seeing out there, and be able to pull that together, thread that together in a useful way for others. Which is what you see activators often doing. They're sort of seeing these bits here, this client experience there, this insight here, and they're able to package that up in a way that's really useful for people in their network, very thoughtful for them.
Yeah, fab. Ted, what other than the Jolt Effect, Challenger Sale,
Mhm.
the other work you've done, what other books? This might be something you were just reading on the lounger last week when you were in Mexico. I don't know. What books have you got that you think people
Yeah.
should listen to,
Well,
read?
so to that point, I'm going to go off camera because I actually am reading a really good book right now called The Demon of Unrest.
The
This
Demon of
is Eric
Unrest.
Larson. Yeah, Eric Larson. So people might know him from Devil in the White City is his most famous book, probably, of um, the intrigue that happened in the World's Fair outside of Chicago, or in Chicago, I should say, in the 1800s. But he's written a number of other books, and this one is about um, Fort Sumter, right before the beginnings of the Civil War here in the U.S. So, really good book. He wrote one about World War II as well, with Churchill, which was a really good one as well. So that's my most recent. Well, it's a nonfiction read. But there was two others on my bookshelf that I was just looking at because you had mentioned you might ask me this. So, The Power of Regret, Dan Pink. His
Oh
book,
yeah.
he writes some really terrific stuff, and really like a lot of the things that Dan has done. But The Power of Regret happened to be a really one of my favorites of his. Kim Scott, who wrote Radical Candor, is another great book that we cite in the Jolt Effect. It's a skill we see sellers doing as a way to spend a little bit of trust, perhaps when they've actually earned it. Sort of calling time out and displaying some radical candor. Hey, is this really the question that you're trying to get to, or is there something else kind of behind this? So it's an interesting book. And then there's another book called Anti Fragile that I really like,
Yeah.
by Taleb. He's written a bunch of stuff, including The Black Swan. But I thought this was kind of an interesting, of these times type things about the way that people can find. It's about things that gain from disorder is what it's about. So it's kind of an interesting read as well.
Fab. Thank you very much. I've got a couple of, I've got some quick fire questions for you. You
Sure,
ready?
let's do it.
What drives you every day?
You know, I mean, there's a whole bunch of like probably personal stuff that drives me. Doing well by my family, faith and what have you. On a professional level, I think I love ideas and I love growth. So,
Okay.
for me, the reason I started, people might have heard me say this before, and it's very nerdy, I'll admit, but I sort of grew up professionally at this company called CEB, which is now part of Gartner. Um, CEB had this ethos at the time that ideas have economic value, which I always loved, just as a concept that just the very existence of an idea can create economic value and create opportunity for people. I just love the power of ideas and playing a very small part in finding new insights and spreading those in ways that are helpful for others. And then just growth, so as a owner of a co-owner of a couple of small businesses, it's kind of what I've chosen to do with my career, and looking for ways to, create new opportunities and new growth is always a fun thing.
Fab. What's your genius?
Oh man, I wish you'd given me these questions ahead of time.
That would be no
Perhaps.
fun, though. That would be no fun.
So look, I think I was lucky enough, as I mentioned, my experience at CEB to be sort of a trained qualitative and quantitative researcher. I think we're really good at, looking at very large data sets, looking at lots of disparate bits of information and pulling out, what are the compelling two or three things that are worth paying attention to? What's the newsworthy bits of it? And so I like thinking hard about hard things and then
Yeah.
finding ways to kind of extract that. It's maybe maybe not the best way to spend a lot of time because it could be hard and frustrating, but I find it rewarding, and it's something that I think we're pretty good at.
Brilliant. What unpopular opinion do you hold?
Ooh, what unpopular opinion do I hold? Okay, so this one's kind of off the wall, but maybe you'll like it. So, and every time I tell people this, they think I'm crazy, but I know that I'm not. Okay, so the I think it's crazy that people say the year like 2024, right? It should be 2024. And we all made this mistake starting in the early 2000s because we're saying it's an inefficient way to say the year. So when I was born in 1979, right? We didn't say I was born in 1979. But now we're going to make this mistake for the next, 1,000 years, I guess, because you're just committed to saying it this way. It's a crazy thing, a little hang up that I have, but it's an unpopular opinion because people are stuck in their ways of saying 2024.
And of course, once you point it out to them, they either have to agree with you and say they have been stupid for a while, or they have
That's
to
right.
double down and keep doing what they were doing and tell you you're mad. Yeah, no, I
They
like
just
that.
that's pretty much the route they go. They just tell me I'm silly for even having thought about it, but and
I like that.
they're
That's
probably
like
correct.
in search of efficiency. What's the most significant risk you've taken?
Well, starting a couple, co-founding a couple of businesses is probably the most
Okay.
significant business risk. And I mean, even like professionally, again, I know we've mentioned CB a little bit, but I was newly married, had to move my family from Chicago to Washington D.C. Not much of a support network. My wife went to school out east, and so we had some family out there, but I didn't really know all that many people, and it was a new risk that I took career wise at the time. That felt certainly risky at the time, anyway.
Very good. You're not indecisive then. You're not that indecisive
Well,
non-personal
I
risk
can be
taker.
indecisive when I go to purchase things too. We talked about that, right? So you might be very decisive in certain situations, and then you go to buy something, and it unlocks indecision in different ways.
How do you measure success?
Look, I think success is one of those, like, by definition, sort of eye of the beholder type things, and we all can look at our metrics and look at growth, the scoreboard, if you will, as to what success is. But I think, not to be too corny, but I think success is ultimately you feel like you're doing right by the people that you love, and that you're able to provide for them in ways that fulfills their needs. And hopefully along the way you have some fun.
Yeah.
I like to say, what if I've had some jobs where I didn't laugh all that much, and I always felt like, hey, if I'm gonna go dedicate my time to this, I want to go someplace and laugh. So if I can find myself laughing and successful, then all the better.
Brilliant. What's the most recent thing you've learned or the most recent skill you've acquired?
I guess it's still in its very infant stages, but
Yeah.
dappling with Gen AI tools out there, ChatGPT, trying to learn a little bit about prompts and what's the best way to do it. I am a novice, to say the least, in that skill, but I think there's a little bit of magic to the what types of prompts do you give them and whatnot. But again, just dabbling here and there on that.
Yeah. Okay.
Drowning more like it than really learning those skills, I think. Yeah.
What's the worst business advice you've ever received?
I mean, I think in general, the trying to be all things to all people is a tough thing to do. If you can't answer, who's your target, audience, who you're really trying to speak to create this offering that is built for everyone. I think it creates all sorts of downstream, uh, you know, bad effects where you're trying to stretch into too many different places, do too many different things, and so focus obviously is the easier way to say that, and I don't think that's newsworthy for people, but it's kind of the opposite. There's a lot of other situations out there where people, in fact, you can tell are trying to be kind of all things to all people.
Yeah. Ted, absolutely brilliant chatting with you today. Thank you for
Thank you.
coming on and sharing your wisdom with us.
You kept me on my toes.